Alexander Selkirk slammed into the rocks with a hollow thud. The desperate pursuit of the very food he needed to live may be what kills him. His leg was twisted and useless. He couldn't stand, he couldn't crawl. For nearly a full day, he laid there helpless, bleeding, and alone. He had no food, he had no fire, and he certainly had no one to hear him scream. He hadn't washed ashore in some storm. He was marooned on a jagged scrap of land in the Pacific Ocean, off the coast of Chile, far beyond any hope of rescue. He had escaped what he believed was certain death, aboard a worm-riddled ship captained by a man who seemed determined to get everyone killed. Selkirk wasn't looking for solitude. He was simply trying to survive. But here he was, broken, starving in the year 1704. How we could possibly survive this is almost mind-boggling, but this is the question we're going to try and answer today. This is the true story of a man pushed to the edge of survival, so let's dive into it. This starts with a ship named the Cinque Ports, which is French for 5 ports. It was a privateer and a government-sanctioned pirate ship sailing the Pacific to hunt Spanish treasure. Selkirk had joined the voyage in 1703 at 27 years old as a sailing master, part of a 2-ship expedition led by the famous navigator William Dampier. But Dampier didn't command Selkirk's ship. That fell to the captain, Thomas Stradling, a young rigid officer with little experience and even less patience. By the time they rounded Cape Horn, the mission was already rotting, literally. Tropical heat and storms had soaked the hull. Worms had bored deep into the planks, weakening its frame. Water seeped in from every seam. Even at anchor, the ship sat wrong on the water, almost as if it had begun to sag in the center. Provisions in the ship were even worse. Salt beef swam in brine thick with mold, hardtack crawled with weevils, and the crew was slowly starving, and everyone knew it. Men whispered about turning back. It seemed like one more storm might break the ship in half. It's at this point that Selkirk begged Captain Stradling to stop. He laid out the risks. He didn't think that the Cinque Ports could survive another leg up the South American coast, but the captain refused. For him, fear by his crew was just a matter of discipline. He didn't take this as a warning that they were headed to danger, but simply as that Selkirk wouldn't follow line. But Selkirk had had enough, and he finally snapped. He demanded that he be left behind. He said that he'd rather take his chances alone on an uninhabited island than die at sea under a man he believed to be reckless. And much to his surprise, Stradling actually agreed. Maybe he thought that Selkirk would cave, or maybe truly he just wanted him gone. Either way, Selkirk's gear was hauled to the beach. It included a musket, some gunpowder, a kettle, and his bedding. He was also left with a few simple tools. Selkirk stood alone on the beach, simply watching the Cinque Ports slip away slowly over the horizon. The moment the sails vanished, Alexander Selkirk was hit with the weight of what he'd done. He stood alone on the shoreline, a jagged bay of volcanic rock backed by dense green hills he didn't recognize. He was surrounded by oceans so wide that it completely swallowed the horizon. The silence hit harder than he expected. No wood creaking on the ship, no crew talking, nothing but wind and birds and the churn of the sea. He was left with enough supplies, likely to last him only a few days. He did have a small cooking pot, which he knew would be of a lot of use. His first move was pure instinct: find water. He followed the slope of land until he reached a small stream. It was cutting through the forest and it seemed like the water was clean, cold, and fast moving. And for now, it was life-saving. He knew next he would need shelter. He returned to the beach trying to build something basic from driftwood and palm branches, but the wind tore it apart by nightfall. The first night was worse than anything he could have imagined. The sea lions came ashore in herds, massive groaning animals, bulls the size of small boats, howling like dying men. Selkirk had never heard anything like it. Their calls echoed through the cove, bouncing off the cliffs and pulsing through his chest like thunder. He never slept a wink. He barely even breathed. And that's when the rats came. There were hundreds. They swarmed the beach after dark, drawn by the scent of his bedding and food. While he laid there, they bit his hands, his feet, and his face. In the moments where he even slipped into a little bit of sleep, he awoke covered in them, and he would begin flailing, and he noticed that his arms were even bleeding. This was literal hell for him. The food was no better. At first, he tried eating the crayfish he found near the rocks of the ocean, but they made him violently ill, with cramps, nausea, and worse. His body simply rejected them. At this point, he was dehydrated, dizzy, and scared. And most of all, he was utterly alone. Every day, he would climb to a rise and scan the ocean. He waited to see sails, a mast, a shadow, anything that could be rescued. But the water stayed empty. And in those first weeks, the only thing louder than the screaming of the seals and the rat was the sound of his own thoughts and the rumble in his stomach. At this point, he had a nagging feeling of regret, and he truly started to wonder if he had made the right choice. Well, I don't want to sound like a screaming sea lion here. I'm running this channel as a small independent creator. Every subscription really helps. And if you like or dislike this video, it really helps me know whether or not to make more of this content. That's all I gotta say, and I'm gonna slink off back into the water. Somehow, he managed to make it through the first few weeks, foraging what little he could from the forest, but he knew it just wasn't enough. And this is when Selkirk makes a decision. If no one is coming to rescue him, he better stop waiting and he better start moving. He packed what little he had and climbed into the hills, away from the shoreline, away from the seals and rats, and into the more thick vegetation. And there among the steep ridges and the green vegetation, he started to rebuild. He found a ridge that was actually high enough that he could scan the ocean in every direction daily. And from here, he could see everything. And more importantly, it was also a spot where he knew he could signal passing ships. Selkirk began crafting what he could. He built 2 shelters from branches, bark, and grass. One was to sleep in, and one was to cook in. Keeping the food away from him meant keeping the rats possibly off him when he slept. Because even inland, they still did seem to find him from time to time. He certainly wasn't a trained survivalist, but he wasn't helpless either. He'd grown up in a rough coastal town in Lower Largo of Scotland. He was the son of a tanner, and he was familiar with tools, sailing, and fixing things. And out here, every scrap of that knowledge mattered, especially considering he knew how to tan leather and things like that. That's pretty valuable in a survival situation. Though I'm not sure if he knew how to do it the natural way with like the brains of animals, or if he knew how to do it with the chemicals and acids of that day. But if you ever find yourself in a survival situation, that is the gross way that you have to do it, basically, is to use and mush up the brain of the animal that you killed and use it to treat the hide to make yourself your own animal skins. Kind of gross and violent, but it is what it is. But the island itself wasn't your typical island. It had its own very strange ecology because it was full of goats and cats, none of which were native. They'd been left behind by earlier privateers, released deliberately so that future crews could hunt fresh meat or control vermin. The goats had overrun the hills, but luckily for Selkirk, they would become a food source. Interestingly, he was able to actually forage the island and find things like turnips, cabbage, palm, and berries, which provided the nutrients that kept him healthy enough to balance a diet of meat. The cats, abandoned and feral, had gone wild in the brush. Unfortunately, we also know that there was an overpopulation of rats. This made the cats happy, but they made life on the island hell for Selkirk. At night, his shelter, like I said, was swarmed by rats. They would chew through not only him, but his gear. So he had the idea to start coaxing cats into his camp, one at a time. He left scraps of meat near the fire, kept still, and waited. Over time, they crept closer. Eventually, they began to stay. Dozens of them began sleeping around his camp, forming a living barrier of eyes and claws that kept the rats away. They even started to have their own litters of kittens. In the loneliness, they were both pets and his only defense system against the rats that drove him crazy. The goats, like I mentioned, provided a great food source for Selkirk to hunt. They provided meat and hides. Using his knowledge, he is able to turn their skin into thread and cloth for making clothing and stitching together shoes. It was even said that he actually found a nail that he was able to hammer out into a sewing needle. Now, eventually though, his gunpowder would begin to run low. He stopped using his musket, and instead he began to run the goats down with his bare hands. He would chase them through the volcanic hills until he could catch them by hand. These goats hadn't exactly evolved around predators, so they're easy for Selkirk to outsmart. Slowly, he just developed a daily routine of survival by gathering food, water, firewood, and maintaining his shelter. In the monotony of that routine one day, he looked up and to his surprise, he saw sails. He scrambled to light a signal fire and smoke rose. But the ships didn't turn. They were too far out, and he watched them slowly fade into the horizon, and there he was alone again. Something gnawed at him though. He couldn't shake it. And this is when his mind starts to really doubt his choice to stay, because he couldn't help but think that his future may have been better on that boat. But what he couldn't have known was that the Cinque Ports never would finish its mission. It had sank only weeks after leaving Juan Fernandez Island, her hull finally giving out, and most of the crew either drowned or ended up in Spanish prisons. Selkirk had literally escaped death, but there was nobody that could come and tell him that. Since missing the sails on the horizon, Selkirk began to feel very hopeless. At this point, the days began to blur into each other, but Selkirk kept his routine: fire, foraging, and keeping a lookout for more boats. I can't stress again how important it is in survival situations to keep yourself into a routine. Not only does it keep you psychologically fit to deal with the situation you're in, it prevents your mind from wandering to very unhelpful places. Things out there are probably terrifying, and having that routine is like a glue that will hold you together. And part of that routine was that he would hunt goats when he could, and he was smart enough to actually take some of the meat and dry it for future use. But this routine of survival, though bare and repetitive, it filled the silence and it kept his mind busy. That was until it didn't. One morning, with his food stores running low, he spotted a young goat alone along the ridge. He didn't think much of it, he just moved, chasing it uphill fast and barefoot through the loose rocks. He had done this many times before, but unfortunately, this time the slope would give way underfoot, and suddenly he found himself falling down a ridge, across jagged rocks, until everything went white. The pain was so unbearable that he passed out, and when he came to, he couldn't move. His leg was twisted, and he was bleeding from his head, his hands, and his arms. The goat that he was chasing was gone, and at this point, enough time had passed that the sun was gone too. He spent nearly a full day stuck on that ridge, alone, silent, and broken. He didn't cry for help, and there was nobody certainly to hear it. All he could do was stare up at the sky, watching the moon rise and fall, measuring time by its arc. And somewhere in the stillness, it started to hit him. Nobody was coming. Not today. Not ever. That moment almost broke him. He could have just died there. No one would have known. No one would have looked. But something in him, maybe just instinct or defiance, made him crawl. And he began, inch by inch, crawling across the rock and brush, dragging his shattered body back to camp. When he finally collapsed beside his shelter, he didn't feel victorious. He felt exhausted. He tore strips of cloth from what was left of his bedding and packed his wounds with moss and ash to slow the bleeding. For days, he lay still. He had a fever that was keeping him in and out of consciousness. He was able to splint his broken leg with cut branches and goat sinew. All he had to eat was what he could reach. Weeks would pass before he was able to stand on his own again, and even longer before he could walk without collapsing. And even then, he would be walking with a limp, dragging his leg, and this is where Selkirk begins to lose grip on how long he's actually on the island. Time didn't pass anymore in days, it passed in seasons. The rains would come, then the wind, then the dry heat, and after that, the fog. Selkirk marked time by the moon, by the shifting stars, and by the wear on his tools. He stopped counting days, not because he lost track, because they just didn't mean anything to him anymore. At some point, it shifted for him. He wasn't just waiting for rescue anymore, he was living his life. One thing that Alexander Selkirk did that's kind of ingenious was that he began taming goats instead of hunting them, because he was literally worried he could break his leg again, and he wanted to keep some of the slower goats close to camp in case he found himself too sick or injured to ever chase them. He knew he couldn't afford another fall, and he was preparing for a version of the future where things could potentially be worse. Things for him were truly feeling desperate and lost, but the one thing he did was continue his routine. He started watching for passing ships again, reading from his Bible, and doing whatever he could to maintain his camp. But in one of his most darkest moments, when it seems like things were very, very hopeless, things took a turn very quickly. It started with a sound, faint and distant, then shapes on the horizon. It was sailcloth in the wind. Selkirk climbed to his lookout with his heart pounding. It was as if God had played a cruel joke on them. He finally saw ships, but those flags weren't English. They were Spanish. He knew exactly what that meant. He would be taken prisoner, maybe tortured, and maybe hanged. Spain was their enemy after all. So instead of signaling for rescue, he ran, deep into the hills, into the green-black silence of the interior, where no man could follow him without knowing the land. He stayed hidden here for days. The first time that they passed offshore, close but not close enough to land. Selkirk just stayed in the hills, watching the sails drift past, holding his breath with every gust of wind. But the second time, they came ashore. He was high in the trees when he heard them, boots on stone, the crack of voices, and the clatter of gear. It was a small search party moving through the underbrush. One man wandered off from the group and stopped to relieve himself at the base of Selkirk's tree, Selkirk was motionless. He didn't breathe. He just sat there pretending he didn't exist. And lucky for him, they left without seeing him. He waited hours before climbing down. Selkirk actually stayed hidden for days and eventually weeks, almost starving himself to death. Even after returning to the camp, he lived like he might have to run again. He slept lightly and kept his fire low. His eyes were always on the horizon. More time passed, but how much, he wasn't sure. Months, maybe another season. The island had no clocks, so it was always a guess. But in reality, it was 1709, and that's when he saw sails again. At first, he was filled with fear, but then he noticed there was different rigging. They had a smaller silhouette, and as they got closer, he could see English colors. Selkirk's body moved before his mind caught up. He scrambled to his lookout and lit his signal fire, a stack of dry pepper wood and bark that he kept ready for years. Thick smoke curled up into the blue sky, his hands shaking the whole time. This time the ship turned. It was the Duke, a British privateer under Captain Woodes Rogers. When the landing party finally reached shore, they saw a man emerge from the brush. At first, they didn't know what they were looking at. It was somebody that was ragged, could barely speak, and looked like they had weathered more storms than a century-old ship. He was barely understandable, and most of the words he tried to utter were caught in his throat. He hadn't spoke to another human in over 4 years. Rogers would later go on to describe this guy as the governor of the island. Selkirk served them goat stew with island herbs, helped them treat their scurvy with local vegetation, and when they asked if he wanted to leave, he didn't hesitate. He immediately boarded the Duke. But not as a survivor, is actually part of the crew. And for the first time in 4 years, the chatter of other sailors' voices wasn't just in his head. But Selkirk didn't go home right away. As I mentioned, he actually joined the crew of the Duke, and he sailed with them for another 2 years, helping raid Spanish ships and ports along the South American coast. He ended up being promoted to mate, respected for his navigational skills and his survival instincts. It was sometime during that voyage that he finally learned what happened to the Cinque Ports, his old ship, the one that he refused to stay on. It had gone down, like I mentioned, not long after abandoning him on the island of Juan Fernandez. Selkirk really had made the right call, but the knowledge didn't come with relief, it came with weight. He'd been right, and he paid for that truth by having to live 4 years of hell on an island by himself. And when he finally returned to Britain, stories about him were already circulating. A man marooned, living off of goats and herbs as a wild survivor. He became a curiosity, the castaway who outlived his ship. What he managed to accomplish on that island with nothing like building the shelters, tanning hides, making clothes, was almost unheard of in that time. And writers like Richard Steele would capture fragments of his experience, describing a man serious, weathered, and changed. Years later, Daniel Defoe published the book Robinson Crusoe. The influence was obvious: a solitary man stranded on an island, surviving off the land, crafting shelter, clothing, and even taming animals. The world connected the dots. This was the real-life Robinson Crusoe. But for Selkirk, his experience wasn't fiction. And what he accomplished, seriously, is almost unbelievable. I can see why it's a book. I can see why you'd want to make movies about this. The guy would literally taming cats to kill rats and taming goats, chasing them down by hand. This guy literally is the type of person movies should be made about. It would be years before he actually returned to Scotland. And at this point, the world had already moved on. And so had he mostly. He did sail again for a time, tried life on land, and even married. But he was never the same. He spoke little of the island because no one could really understand it. The silence, the rats, the waiting, the pain. He hadn't just survived the wilderness. He made a life on that island. Something that, probably nobody could understand. I just want to say this story really resonates with me. I find it's absolutely incredible. It's an example of kind of what exactly you should do in a survival situation. First, find water, then find heat and shelter. Find ways to get food, find ways to keep a routine. And, if you can do that and with a little bit of luck and a little bit of cooperation from Mother Nature, who's not always on your side, you might just get yourself out of that situation. I can't imagine what he went through, but man, what a story. And I want to thank you guys for tuning in this week, and I'll be back again next week with another crazy historical story. See you then.